a logical calculus of the ideas immanent in the nervous activity. Here, McCulloch and Pitts in 1943, they established a neuron model that was inspired by how the brain works in order to, by putting together a lot of those neural models to create a sort of artificial brain, an electronic brain. And then later in the 50s, 1950, on Mind, Quarterly of Psychology and Philosophy, Alan Turing published his work on computing machine and intelligence. And here Turing starts with a very interesting question in what he calls the imitation game, also known as the Turing test. And he proposes to consider the question, can machines think? So he was interested in this question, can machines then encompass a sort of thinking, a sort of mind? This was his kind of motivation in the 50s. And then in 1956, the first time the word intelligence was used was by this text on the Dartmouth Summer Research Project on AI, where different prominent scientists of that time wanted to meet for a summer project to study intelligence. And they say the study is to proceed on the basis of the conjecture that every aspect of learning and any other feature of intelligence can be in principle modeled and simulated in a machine. So they thought, okay, we can model and simulate a sort of general intelligence. I think this was the noble starting goal of AI, create an artificial brain, a thinking machine, a machine capable of general intelligence. So I think that's what the roots of AI are. However, nowadays, if we look at some definitions of AI, for example, the ones of the high-level expert group on AI by the European Union, here there is quite a strong focus on the narrow AI. So AI refers to systems designed by humans that, given a complex goal, they do a lot of things, reason and interpret data and learn, etc., to achieve the given goal. So there is this view of AI as a discipline encompassing a lot of areas, but really focused on solving concrete tasks, perhaps better than humans. So I think there is this origin of AI as a general intelligence sort of goal, strong AI. However, weak AI is the focus of most research today. And one of the key questions of the community is, can just scaling up the current approach lead to more general intelligence? And here is a slide from a quite famous debate between Gary Marcus and Jan LeCun in 2017. I mean, they disagree on quite a lot, but in this case, they actually agreed on a few points that AI is still a discipline in its infancy, and machine learning is fundamentally necessary for reaching a strong AI. However, the deep learning paradigm alone is not enough, according to them, to reach human level general intelligence. And just a few days ago, there was a debate on Twitter where Jan LeCun was mentioning, on the highway towards human level AI, large language model is an off-ramp, maybe a bit kind of extreme here, but saying that, okay, just these kind of large language models alone are insufficient for general intelligence. I mean, you might agree or not disagree, but there is a kind of interesting question here. First of all, the narrow AI is great. I mean, it's very important that we all continue to do that and solve important societal problems like protein folding and many others, I mean, to help people and help improve our lives. However, if we also think of achieving more general intelligence, we are also addressing questions like, can this paradigm really scale? Is it sustainable in the long term? Or what can we be doing differently? And I think there are some points that I would like to address that might be an argument on also looking at alternatives. And here is a research from Strabel and others on basically the carbon footprint of training large AI models, where we see that, for example, a round trip from New York to San Francisco is around 2,000 CO2 equivalent, and a transformer with neural architecture search is way beyond that, as you see in this graph. So the amount of CO2 that is produced by the training part of this model, it's way larger than the impact, for example, of 1 year of the CO2 produced by an individual. And I think if we look at BERT, for example, language models that Google is using for search and translation, is equivalent pretty much to a round trip from New York and San Francisco with a flight. So it's quite remarkable. Also, in terms of how much it would cost if one want to train those large language models, I think they are quite surprising, the cost that you would need in cloud compute cost to train those models. So I think this is also a problem of cost, but also of democratizing AI. Not all labs have this capacity to run these models. They have the hardware or they have the money. There are many universities in the third world countries that they don't have this capacity. It's also about democratizing AI research. So I think I don't want to go too more on that, but here we are looking at models in the order of millions of parameters. And we know this story of like increasing the number of parameters with DALL-E with 12 billion parameters. And we had make a video from Meta, even more parameters. And we have Cicero, this is quite remarkable, also a language model that can work with diplomacy, also increasing the number of parameters. We have the switch transformer. This is not super new, but here we are moving towards trillion parameters. Okay, so this is one order of magnitude, even more than that. So I think there is this trend. And then this led me to make this sort of a simple calculation. So perhaps this is not super accurate, but I would like to point out that the total number of neurons in the brain is estimated to something around 10 to the power of 11. And there are around 700 to 1,000 trillion synapses in the brain. Okay, and this is a very small, very small energy consumption of around 12 watts. So it's a very sort of a very optimized computing machine using very little energy to sustain all this neural activity. Okay, so now if we think instead of number of neurons or synapses in a small cubic millimeter of cortex, this is around 700 million synapses, around 100,000 neurons. So this is switch transformer with 1 trillion parameter is around equivalent, if we make this analogy, to around 1 cubic centimeter of what we have as a cortex in the brain. So I think if we think that the brain volume is around 1,200 cubic centimeters, what we can do, what we can simulate with these large language models is very little. So I think in case we want to actually simulate or achieve the performance of an entire brain, it's still beyond what we can do now. And it's probably beyond what can be done with the physical limitations that we have in compute and hardware in the future. So I'm not sure that this is entirely scaling if we want to achieve that high level of computing and power of the brain. Also, one question that arises that does AI learn like the brain? So we all know that the backpropagation is a very optimized algorithm for training neural networks, differentiable neural networks using stochastic gradient descent. So the functions have to be differentiable. However, the brain is not necessarily, or there is uncertainty whether the brain is implementing some form of backpropagation, and the community is trying to basically understand how that could be done in the brain, but it's considered quite implausible that the brain is able to perform this sort of gradient descent. So here, prominent scientists, also among the top scientists in AI, they are arguing that we need to move toward biologically plausible deep learning, etc. I think there is an interesting trend here. I think I would like to briefly mention some of the biologically questionable aspects of backpropagation. So here I list many. Of course, we could talk for quite some time about that, but let me focus, for example, on a few of them. So the lack of local error. So we know that in backpropagation we have a forward pass, and then we have the backward pass, where the global error is calculated, and then it's back propagated towards the entire network. So I mean, this is quite difficult to implement biologically, because in biology the synapses change based only on the local activity. There is no global error calculation that is backward propagated. Also, this back propagation implies that you have the forward and backward weights that are basically mirrored. You would have one connection in one way with a weight, and the same weight is also used to back propagate. So I think this is also quite implausible. At the same time, the models of neurons are quite unrealistic. We have this kind of summation of input and then activation function, but real neurons use spikes. They don't use like continuous output. Also, I mean, all signals are propagated very synchronously, layer by layer in deep learning, in a form like if there was a clock. And this is also highly implausible in the brain, that there is a kind of a general clock controlling that. Also, there is this sort of supervision of comparison of expected versus correct value. And I mean, we could go on. For example, once the network is trained and the weights are frozen, and then we use the network for a task in the brain, there is no frozen aspect. There is like an ongoing online learning throughout the lifetime. There are a few aspects that are unplausible, and I think they should be addressed. And recently, we were quite inspired by this paper. It's a white paper by some prominent American scientists like Bengio and Zador and Terry Senowski, the president of NeurIPS, Jan LeCun and others, talking about the next generation AI catalyzing the neuro AI revolution. So I think here it's quite interesting because we are approaching some technological limits in how much transistors we can put on a chip, and we are hitting some walls. I mean, we all know the Moore's law, and we all know that we are trying ways to kind of mitigate or support this. However, there are some limitations. So what they're suggesting instead is to use the brain as an inspiration. So develop new hardware and AI algorithms that are scalable and efficient, etc., using some form of brain-inspired self-organization, and using models of neurons to guide the development here. So to cite them, to quote what they propose, I think this is a nice sentence here. A better understanding of neural computation will reveal the basic ingredients of intelligence and catalyze the next revolution in AI, eventually leading to artificial agents with capabilities that match and perhaps even surpass those of humans. So we believe it is the right time for a large-scale effort to identify and understand the principles of biological intelligence and abstract those for application in computer and robotics systems. Okay, so what's about biological intelligence? Because so if we look at how neurons really work in biology, we see that we have a neuron, like the one in orange here, and we see that there are some other neurons that are connected to it. There are some dendrites, those kind of tentacles that connect this neuron to the previous neurons here. And then the neuron has this kind of a soma, this cell body, and then has a long like axon that is some kind of wire that transmits information, and those axon terminals then connect to the postsynaptic neuron at the synaptic point, a synapse. And the synapse is what we model typically as a kind of a weight in our artificial neural network. However, in biology, the synapse is not really a physical contact point. There is some kind of space between the axon terminal of a neuron and the postsynaptic terminal. There is some kind of a space in which some neurotransmitters are released. Yes? Was there some, I heard some sound? No? Right. So there is some presynaptic neuron and postsynaptic neuron, and the way the signals are transmitted, the electrical signals are transmitted, those spikes, are by releasing some neurotransmitters, some chemicals. And we can think of like some molecules released in this synaptic space. And on the other side, we can think of some kind of docking stations where the right neurotransmitters can attach and transmit, in fact, over this non-contact, point of non-contact, an electrical signal. I think this is quite interesting, and we can model this somehow also with more accurate models of artificial neural network. For example, spiking neuron models, where we have now spikes coming in and synapses that are of a certain strength, and then the neuron has some kind of membrane potential. It has a threshold at which the neurons fires, and then at each incoming spikes, there is some increase in the potential of the neuron. The neuron state is increased by an amount that equivalent to the weight of the strength of the synapse. And then there is some kind of leakage of current. So if nothing happens, the potential in the neuron decreases over time. And this builds up while the spikes come in. And then if the membrane potential goes over the threshold of the neuron, then there is a reset and the spike in output is produced. So I think we can make those more bio-inspired models. And those models learn with some kind of local learning rules. For example, if we have now two neurons, the neuron J, call it presynaptic neuron, and the neuron I, the postsynaptic neuron, and they have a weight in between that is connecting them. And if we think that the presynaptic neuron spikes first and the postsynaptic neuron spikes after, it means that this postsynaptic neuron is triggered by the presynaptic spike. And therefore, there is a causal effect. And therefore, the weight of the connection should be strengthened. However, if the postsynaptic neuron would spike before the presynaptic neuron, then there is not such an effect. It was independent, and therefore the synaptic strength should be decreased. On top of that, we have also excitatory synapses that increase the potential and inhibitory synapses that decrease the potential. So we could do also all those tricks to implement more biologically plausible neural networks. I also want to mention a very interesting work, very inspiring, just from a few weeks ago, from Geoffrey Hinton, considered one of the fathers of deep learning. He was proposing a new algorithm instead of backpropagation. He called it the forward algorithm, where it does not encompass for a backward pass. So here he has an update rule that is totally local instead. He has one pass with some kind of positive data that is supposed to maximize some function in one layer, and then he has another forward pass right after with some data that instead is negative or corrupted that should minimize a certain function in the layer. And he is also discussing what is wrong with backpropagation, some of the limitations that we have just mentioned now. But among them, I just want to mention backpropagation. He mentioned that there is no convincing evidence that the cortex explicitly propagates errors, derivatives. And also, quite interesting, he focuses on the mortal computation. If you want trillion parameters neural net, not to only consume a few watts, if you want trillion parameter neural net to only consume a few watts, mortal computation may be the only option. So not like immortal, where you can download the weights and instantiate a new network, but a network that is built and developed and grown just for that purpose. So I think this is a very interesting paradigm shift that is proposing here, a bit extreme, but inspiring for me. So I think, how can we then improve AI? So what is biological intelligence? And biological intelligence, I mean, one could think of something like that. If you look at the neurons, you could think of like some very dynamic system with some cells that are moving around, and they are trying to connect with each other to create neural networks. They are not static. They move, they connect, and they disconnect. They grow. Sometimes they die. Sometimes they decide to connect and then decide that they don't want to connect anymore and they disconnect. So I think we need to model something more like that. We have to understand more about what are the processes behind this biological mechanism here to improve the neural networks that we have. So in my lab and in collaborating lab to address this problem, we work with so-called microelectrode arrays. Those are some kind of devices. You can think it of as a small petri dish that you have in a wet lab. So we have like this dish, and here inside here you can grow some cells, you can grow some neurons. And underneath there are some small wires, some kind of electrodes, point of contact with the neurons. And you can do that in a lab without, implanting neurons in the brain of an animal. And here we have a picture, a zoomed in picture of like what it might look like to grow neurons on a petri dish. This is done in our collaborating lab, scientific lab, neuroscience lab. So here we see like cluster of neurons that have been grown, and you see some synapses, some weights that can change over time and connect them. And the black dots are the wire, the electrodes, where we can record or we can stimulate those neurons. So if we record, we can get a map of how they communicate with each other over time, how they develop over time. Also, what we can do, we can stimulate with electrical activity to incorporate some learning process, because we know that if we stimulate neurons with electrical currents, they might change their behavior. They can strengthen or decrease their synaptic strength. So we can actually do that in a lab. And instead of using models of biological neural network, we can have actual biological neural networks as our AI systems, and we can study them. And we can do a lot of cool stuff. We can study the activity over time. We can then infer some kind of topology model. We can study how information propagates in this network. We can use network theory to study whether the network is self-organizing at the edge of chaos or at criticality, as we call, or if it's subcritical or supercritical and the entire activity takes over the network. Also, what we can do, we can study how the network develops over time. So we can have multiple recordings over a large amount of time, and we can see the network building up, the neural network growing. And then we can also see what happens, what is the effect of learning when we stimulate, and which synapses changes, which synaptic gets stronger, which synapses get weaker. Also, we can have high density arrays of those electrodes with thousands and thousands of electrodes. And here we can make very dense maps, very dense neural networks. And then what we can do, we can instantiate those neural networks extracted from the biological neural network. We can instantiate them as artificial neural networks. And we can test them, how strong they are at, for example, computing some tasks with the paradigm of reservoir computing. Also, we can do some traditional neuroscience experiments that you would have like an animal in a maze, in an environment, and maybe has to navigate, and maybe has to reach some food, maybe carry on a task. Instead, we can actually simulate the body of this animal with some kind of cyborg, some kind of robotic simulated or physical artifact, and then connect it over the internet to the neural network that is grown, the brain that is grown on a petri dish. So we can test basically neuroscience hypothesis using synthetic experiment and using this paradigm of biological neural network as our AI system. We can do all these kind of interesting scenarios. So I think what I would like to try to summarize here some of the ideas. So our design paradigm is to look at the brain and then build bottom-up models, starting from the biological models and moving into the artificial models. And then the tools that we want to use is to use evolution to evolve the genetic representations of our models, and also encompass for the development of the computational structure. So not instantiate a grown neural network, but grow it while it learns with self-organization. And also provide some form of adaptation, some local learning rules, such that the computational structure is dynamic, is changing over time due to the learning. To take this even further about this idea of development in neural networks, we are working particularly with the so-called neural cellular automata. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but the idea here is that self-organization and morphogenesis in ANN are not a very established concept. So there is a field of neurodevelopment that is studying how complexity of the human brain arises from a single cell, or how a body grows or how a brain grows from a single cell through this process of neural development. So even after the brain is grown completely, the development continues. Neurons grow and die until death of the individual, and the changes in the connection and the shape change over time. And this kind of neuroplasticity is considered a very important factor for the emergence of intelligence. However, in artificial neural network, there is a high focus on handcrafted neural networks, some kind of static map of neural connections. We engineer them by hand. And then during what we call learning, which is, as we have said, quite different from the biological learning, those connections are optimized to reduce some error on a specific task. There has been some effort on automatically designing the neural networks, but this is not through development. It's some form of search, some form of navigation on the topological space. So I think this idea of self-organization as a development for neural network is quite new. So here what we have done, we have established some years ago this kind of idea of having a cellular automaton where each rule in the cells is, instead of a lookup table, is a neural network. So instead of having a large neural network, we have a small neural network that are communicating locally with other neural networks, and they can develop over time. So I think this concept has been quite popular recently with the establishment of the neural cellular automaton concept, if you are familiar with that. And we have had some proof of concept that I would like to show you on 3 different tasks. The first one is using this neural CA to solve a control task. So in this case, we can think as a kind of a growing, the self-organizing growing process as a form of cognition. There are a lot of biological organisms, for example, Physarum, this is slime mold, that is using just development, just growth to solve tasks. The intelligence is coming entirely from the growth process. So, for example, here we see that this unicellular organism is able to optimize the path. In this case, approximating what you would see on the roads in a map, when it's trying to optimize the metabolic function and try to spare energy to connect points where there are food sources. So in fact, it's solving an optimization problem just by growth, by development. And so in the brain, we also have this development process. We could say that we have at least 3 key important components here. We have the death and creation of neurons as some kind of growing and regeneration abilities. Also, we have the inhibition of and reinforcement neural circuits. We can see this as a learning. And then we have information transmission with action potential, with those spikes. And this is the computation. But there is no clear boundary. Those things are happening at the same time. There is a continuum between those kind of phases in the brain. So here we have created some kind of a neural cellular automaton. Here, this is a substrate with each cell has a neural network in it. And each neural network does not solve the task. Each neural network just locally gathers the information by the nearby neural networks and updates its own state, like in a cellular automaton, just with the neural network as a rule. And here, we embed some control problem of a reinforcement learning task, like a pole balancing task. We have a pole and the card that has to balance the pole on it. And we have some actuators that we embed with some electrodes in this substrate to control the left and right motor. And there we have the sensory data also embedded in the substrate. So this brain is receiving some sensory data and is controlling through the other points and is self-organizing to control that. So if I run it for some time, we can see that this is self-organizing to some kind of activity. And here, this will increase in the speed. This cart will move on the right and left and will decide based on what is the strongest activity of each of those output cells in which direction it should move. And we can see that it can get quite robust behavior. And this is solved on a different way that what you would do with deep reinforcement learning, where we have a large neural network that you train to solve this task. Instead, here we train a small neural network to communicate locally and to propagate the right neural activity to the neighboring cells between the sensory data and the output where the actuators are located in a completely bottom-up fashion. This approach is also quite robust. Here we have tried to perturb the system, and we see that in this case you will see some island of perturbation that are injected into the system. And we see that the model will be able to cope with that and recover the neural activity. You see that there are some islands. And here it's like the expected reward to move left and right. And we see that there are some big jumps down, representing that there is some noise. But right away, the neural activity is able to be restored to control the task because this is totally distributed intelligence. It's not a centralized one. So if you want more information, we have also some kind of demo that you can access online. You can provide this link at a later stage. Another approach that we are using also with this neural CA models to as a models of development of morphogenesis of both the body and brain of artificial systems is with work that we presented at Gecko last year, where we have a single cell that is grown into a morphology of a robot, and then the robot body is also what is instantiated as a controller. So the robot is instantiating also a neural CA with neural networks in it. So first we have a growth phase where different parts of the robot are grown, like sensors, wheels, or connecting tissue. And then this body is also used to control the robot. So the communication is transmitted from the sensors to the actuators of the robot by some small neural networks that are in each cell. And we try to solve different kinds of tasks, like navigating a robot through some kind of cave and reach a light point, or maybe a robot that has to kick a ball into some kind of target area. And we use evolution to evolve basically the neural networks inside each cell of the neural CA, and then let it first grow and control the robot. Also, we have done some work that we have presented in last year ICLR workshop from Cell to Societies, where we use spiking neural CA. You can think of like this neural network as a spiking neural network, and we use this to control modular robots. You have different morphologies here, like a biped or a comb or a worm, where each of these cells, it's one of these cells in a neural cellular automaton with spiking neurons. And we show that with this approach and with local learning, are able to control the robots for locomotion, but also providing a layer of adaptation, because we know that spiking neurons have this plasticity that we have mentioned before. They are able to also to encompass for some changes in the environment. All right, so I think I would like to not go even further in more details. I would like just to have some acknowledgements for some funding bodies and some colleagues that have helped me out with that. And I would like also to do some advertisement of a conference that we are having here in my institution, in case you are interested in applied AI, human-centric AI. We have a track on that, and we have submission open for a few days. So in case you are interested, I encourage you to visit us in Norway. All right, thank you, and I'll open up for questions or comments or feedback.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefano. It was very interesting talk. So, someone has a question? I check the participants. Seems no.
Questions or comments are also welcome. Criticism are welcome. And
I have a question from my side. Thank you for your inspiring talk. It was very, very inspiring. These new trends in artificial intelligence. I'm aware of the fact that in a recent study, they have discovered that sometimes the synapses does not connect to another neurons, but it connects to another synapses. So my question is, have you ever experienced this behavior in your experiments or?
Yes. So I think it's very fast. First of all, thanks for the question, Vincenzo. And I have to say that as a computer scientist, I'm also very fascinated by by knowing very little how biology works. It's very fascinating inspiring to look at those microscope pictures or like those experiments in the lab. So yes, you're right. So there are some cases where like the connection is not at the at those basically tentacles that you can think of, but it's like in the middle of an axon, for example. And this type of connection, it's typically used to control or to basically perturbate the incoming spiking activity to an axon. So you can think that there is some spiking activity going through one axon that is supposed to reach the synaptic points of the postsynaptic neurons. However, there is some kind of wire connected in the middle of this axon, such that if this neuron is spiking, it can basically stop the activity from going through some kind of modulating process, or it can even actually allow for the spikes to travel backwards. So this has been observed experimentally in the lab. Also, there is some other effect that has been studied that typically when we model neural networks, we tend to optimize the synaptic strengths, the weights. The parameters of neural network are the weights. However, in the biological neurons, there is another degree of freedom that is not only the strength of the synapses, so basically increasing or decreasing the effect that a spike could have on the postsynaptic neuron, but also there is the speed at which the spikes travel. So the signals could also change a different, could travel at different speeds from one neuron to another. In fact, over time, the speed at which spikes travel on the edges that we would use to connect two neurons in an ANN could be different. In fact, we could train the network to propagate the important features faster than the less important features. Not only like increasing the weights to have a larger effect on a certain feature, but we could make also this double effect of strengthening the effect, but as well making it faster, such that the information is propagated faster. So I think this is quite unexplored in artificial neural network, and it's also quite difficult to implement in neuromorphic hardware, because you would have to have some kind of dynamic propagation of the, or some kind of delay mechanism for which the signals travel from one layer to another. However, we need to move beyond this kind of sort of a silicon-based hardware if we want to implement this biological inspired mechanism. So we have to move to some kind of wetware or some kind of novel materials that would address these problems. So yes, I hope that I answered your question, and on top of that, that it's fascinating for computer scientists to look at those things.
Thank you very much for sharing your ideas.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Vincenzo, for a nice question. Someone has other question? Ok, it seems no. Partecipanti, vediamo. If you have, no. Okay, so Stefano, thank you very much for your very nice talk, and thank you very much to everyone for attending the seminars, and I hope to meet you, Stefano, soon.
Yes,
thank you very much.
Thanks again for the invitation, Mario, and I will ask also to exchange the favor and so visit us for a seminar here, perhaps digitally, but also I hope that I can see you in the future in person as well.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Have a nice day. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.